The grand lecture hall at Harvard University buzzed with excitement. Professor Richard Harrington walked in with his head held high, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. At 52, with salt and pepper hair and sharp blue eyes behind expensive glasses, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his worth. Today we dive into the fascinating world of quantum mechanics, he announced, his voice filling the room. Students and colleagues straightened in their seats, notebooks ready. Professor Harrington wasn't just any teacher. He was the star of the physics department, with 3 published books and countless awards to his name. As he began writing complex equations on the board, he noticed something unusual from the corner of his eye. An elderly woman had slipped into the front row. She looked out of place among the young students and fellow academics. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a faded blue cardigan that had seen better days. What caught his attention most were her hands, slightly trembling, with age but moving quickly as she took detailed notes. Who let her in? He thought with a flash of annoyance. These lectures were meant for serious scholars, not random elderly people looking for somewhere warm to sit. Professor Harrington continued his presentation, explaining theories that had taken him years to master. He spoke faster than usual, using complex terms without explaining them, secretly hoping to see confusion on the old woman's face. But each time he glanced her way, she was nodding slightly, still taking notes. And this is where most textbooks get it wrong, he said, pointing to a particularly complicated equation. They failed to account for the quantum tunneling effect when a frail hand rose slowly in the front row. The professor paused mid-sentence, surprised. No one usually interrupted him, especially not, well, whoever this woman was. Yes, he said, sharply, not bothering to hide his irritation. The woman stood up slowly, using her wooden cane for support. I'm sorry to interrupt, Professor, she said in a voice that was quiet but surprisingly clear. But I believe there's a small error in your calculation there. A ripple of whispers spread through the lecture hall. Professor Harrington's cheeks flushed hot. An error? I don't think so, he said with a tight smile. This is a standard approach I've been teaching for 20 years. The woman didn't sit down. With all due respect, sir, if you look at the third line of your equation, you've applied the wrong coefficient. It should be negative, not positive. Otherwise, the energy states won't balance correctly. The room fell silent. Every eye moved from the old woman to the board, then to the professor's reddening face. Professor Harrington turned to the equation, scanning it quickly. His stomach dropped. She was right. It was a small mistake, one that most students wouldn't catch, but it was definitely there. He had written a plus sign where there should have been a minus. For a moment he considered acknowledging the error and thanking her. That's what he would have done if a colleague had pointed it out. But something about being corrected by this stranger, this old woman who shouldn't even understand what he was talking about, made his pride flare up. Ma'am, he said, forcing a condescending smile. These concepts are quite advanced. Perhaps you're confusing this with basic algebra? This is quantum physics. A positive coefficient is correct in this case because we're dealing with an anti-symmetric wave function. It was nonsense, of course. The woman was absolutely right. But he spoke with such authority that several students nodded along, accepting his explanation without question. The woman tilted her head slightly. For a brief moment, something flashed in her eyes. Not anger or embarrassment, but something like disappointment. Without another word, she carefully sat back down and continued taking notes. Professor Harrington quickly erased the equation and rewrote it with the correct sign, pretending he was simply moving to the next step. Now, as I was saying before the interruption, the lecture continued, but he found himself losing his train of thought several times. He kept glancing at the old woman, expecting her to raise her hand again, but she remained silent, her pencil moving steadily across her notebook. When the lecture ended, students gathered around him as usual, asking questions and seeking his approval. By the time the crowd thinned, the old woman had disappeared. Who was that lady in the front? He asked his teaching assistant, trying to sound casual. No idea, Professor. I thought maybe you knew her, the young man replied. She showed Up early, said she was here for the lecture. Had all the right paperwork to get in as a public visitor. Professor Harrington nodded, pretending it didn't matter. But as he packed up his materials, the incident kept replaying in his mind. How did she spot that mistake so quickly? And where? Did she learn enough quantum physics to even understand what he was talking about? That night, in his elegant home filled with books and academic awards, Richard couldn't focus on grading papers. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch and stared out the window at the campus lights in the distance. Just some lucky guess, he muttered to himself. Or maybe she used to be a math teacher or something. But deep down, he knew it wasn't luck. The woman had spotted a subtle error in advanced quantum mathematics in seconds, something even his graduate students might have missed. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office earlier than usual. He had a busy day ahead, a faculty, meeting, office hours, and research to review. But his mind kept wandering back to the old woman. Professor Harrington? His secretary knocked on his open door. Your first appointment is here. Send them in, he said, not looking up from his computer. The door creaked open and he heard the distinctive tap of a cane on the floor. Richard looked up, and there she was, the same elderly woman from the lecture, standing in his office, doorway with a worn leather bag hanging from her arm. Good morning, Professor, she said with a small smile. I hope you don't mind my visit. I have some thoughts about your lecture that I'd like to discuss, if you have the time. Richard's mouth went dry. He should have been polite, should have acknowledged his mistake from yesterday, should have welcomed her input. Instead, a strange competitive feeling rose in his chest. Who was this woman to challenge him on his own turf? Actually, I have just 15 minutes before my next meeting, he lied, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness. But please, have a seat, Ms. Sullivan, she said, carefully lowering herself into the chair across from his desk. Martha Sullivan. The name meant nothing to him, not a famous scientist or mathematician he'd overlooked, just an old woman who somehow knew enough to spot his mistake. Well, Miss Sullivan, he said, tapping his expensive pen against his desk. Before we discuss my lecture, I'm curious. What's your background in physics? It's not every day someone catches a detail in my work. Martha placed her notebook on his desk, open to a page filled with neat, precise handwriting and complex equations. I've been studying on my own for many years, she said simply. Physics has always been a passion of mine. Richard glanced at her notes, his eyes widening slightly at the advanced calculations in the margins. This was no beginner's work. A thought occurred to him, a way to put this woman in her place once and for all. He would pose a problem so complex, so specialized, that only someone with years of formal education could possibly understand it, let alone solve it. That's commendable, he said, reaching for a blank piece of paper. Self-study can be a wonderful hobby for retirement, but since you're interested in quantum mechanics, let me ask you something. He quickly scribbled down an equation, one from his most recent research paper that had stumped even his colleagues for weeks. Just a little puzzle for fun, he said, sliding the paper toward her. Take your time or take it home if you prefer. Martha looked at the equation, her eyes moving slowly across the symbols. For a moment, Richard felt a flash of satisfaction, certain he had finally silenced her. Then she reached for a pencil in her bag. May I? She asked, gesturing to the paper. By all means, he replied, glancing at his watch to emphasize his supposed time constraint. Martha's hand shook slightly as she held the pencil, but her writing was clear and deliberate. She didn't rush or hesitate, working through the problem with methodical precision. Richard watched, his smug smile gradually fading as she filled the page with steps he recognized, and some he didn't. After 5 minutes of complete silence, Martha set down her pencil. I believe that's the solution, she said quietly, turning the paper toward him. Though there might be a more elegant approach. Richard stared at her work, his heart pounding. Not only had she solved the problem correctly, but she had used a method he'd never seen before, one that was simpler and more direct than the approach his team had taken. This is, he began, then stopped, unable to find words that wouldn't reveal his shock. Is it incorrect? Martha asked, genuine concern in her voice. No, he admitted reluctantly. It's an interesting approach. The phone on his desk rang suddenly, making him jump. His secretary's voice came through the speaker. Professor Harrington, Dean Williams is on line 1 about the grant proposal. There was no Dean Williams, no call. His secretary was following protocol, providing him with an excuse to end an uncomfortable meeting. I'm afraid I have to take this, he said, reaching for the phone with barely concealed relief. It's an important call about funding. Martha nodded and carefully gathered her things. Of course. Thank you for your time, Professor. She stood, slowly, leaning on her cane. Perhaps another day we could continue our discussion. As she turned to leave, Richard felt a strange mix of emotions: embarrassment, curiosity, and a growing unease. Who was this woman really? And how did she know so much? Ms. Sullivan, he called just as she reached the door. Where did you study before your self-education? Martha paused, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment, something like sadness crossed her face. Nowhere you would recognize, Professor, she said softly. Times were different then. With that, she walked out, leaving Richard staring at the solution on his desk. A solution that shouldn't have been possible from someone without years of specialized training. As her footsteps faded down the hallway, he picked up the phone. Janet, find out everything you can about a Martha Sullivan. Elderly woman, possibly with some background in mathematics or physics. Something didn't add up, and Richard Harrington didn't like mysteries, especially when they made him look foolish. He would get to the bottom of this one way or another. Richard spent the next few days in a state of distraction. During lectures, his eyes kept drifting to the door, half expecting to see Martha Sullivan walk in. During meetings with colleagues, he found himself wondering if any of them knew who she was. The woman had solved a complex quantum problem with an approach he'd never seen before, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. You seem off this week, remarked his colleague Thomas during their weekly lunch at the faculty club. Everything okay? Richard poked at his salad. Just busy. End of semester madness. Thomas nodded, though his expression showed he didn't quite believe it. Heard an interesting rumor about your Monday lecture. Something about an old lady correcting you? Richard's fork clattered against his plate. Who told you that? One of my grad students was there. Said some elderly woman spotted a mistake in your equation. That true? Richard forced a laugh. Hardly, just a confused visitor who thought she understood what I was talking about. I humored her. Right, Thomas said with a knowing smile. Because the great Richard Harrington never makes mistakes. The comment stung more than it should have. Back in his office, Richard found himself Googling Martha Sullivan physicist and Martha Sullivan mathematician, but nothing relevant came up. Just social media profiles of younger women and obituaries of people who weren't her. His secretary knocked on his door. I have that information you asked for about Martha Sullivan, she said, placing a folder on his desk. That was fast, Richard said, reaching for it immediately. Not much to find, honestly. She's not in any university database. No publications, no academic history I could locate. The only Martha Sullivan who came up in the campus visitor logs is registered as a 78-year-old local resident who's attended various public lectures over the past few months. Physics, mathematics, engineering, seems she gets around. Richard frowned. Nothing else? No background? Education? Nothing I could find, Professor. She hesitated. May I ask why you're so interested in her? Just curious, Richard said dismissively. Thank you, Janet. After she left, Richard leaned back in his chair, frustrated. How could someone with no apparent academic background solve problems that challenged his top PhD students? It made no sense. The following week, Richard was scheduled to give another public lecture, this one on the practical applications of quantum computing. As he entered the hall, his eyes immediately scanned the front row. No Martha Sullivan. He felt an odd mix of relief and disappointment as he began his talk. Halfway through, however, the side door opened quietly, Martha slipped in, taking a seat in the back corner. She wore the same blue cardigan, her silver hair in the same neat bun, her notebook already open on her lap. Richard stumbled over his words momentarily before regaining his composure. This time he was prepared. He had triple-checked every equation, every theory. There would be no mistakes for her to find. He continued with renewed energy, explaining complex concepts with clarity and precision. When he opened the floor for questions, he deliberately looked everywhere but at Martha. Several hands went up, and he called on students, colleagues, visitors, anyone but her. Finally, when he could avoid it no longer, he gestured toward the back corner. Yes, the lady in the back. Martha stood slowly. Thank you for an enlightening lecture, Professor Harrington. I was particularly interested in your thoughts on quantum entanglement as it relates to information transfer. Have you considered the implications of Bell's theorem when applied to your third model? It was a sophisticated question, one that probed the very edges of his research. Richard felt a prickle of irritation. Was she trying to trip him up again? Bell's theorem is certainly relevant, he replied carefully. But in the context of quantum computing, we often focus more on practical applications rather than philosophical implications. I understand that, Martha persisted gently. But if Bell's non-locality principle holds true, wouldn't that challenge your assumption about information containment in your quantum bits model? A murmur went through the audience. It was a valid point, one that Richard had deliberately glossed over because he didn't have a solid answer for it yet. That's certainly one interpretation, he said, his voice tighter than he intended. But the mathematical models support my conclusion, as demonstrated by the Lou Harrington paper published last year. Martha nodded and sat down, but Richard could see she wasn't convinced. Neither were some of his colleagues, judging by their expressions. After the lecture, Richard quickly gathered his materials, hoping to avoid further questions. But as the crowd thinned, he saw Martha making her way toward him, moving slowly with her cane. Professor Harrington, she called softly. Might I have a word? Richard considered pretending he hadn't heard her, but too many people were watching. Of course, he said, forcing a smile. But I'm afraid I only have a few minutes. When the last students had left, Martha approached his podium. I wanted to apologize if my questions seemed confrontational, she said. That wasn't my intention. Richard was caught off guard by her apology. No need, he said stiffly. Academic discourse thrives on challenging questions. Indeed it does, she agreed, which is why I hoped we might continue our discussion from your office. I've been working on some ideas that relate to your research, and I'd value your opinion. Richard hesitated. Part of him wanted nothing more than to dismiss this woman and her mysterious knowledge. But another part, the scientist in him, was undeniably curious. I suppose I could spare half an hour next Monday, he said reluctantly. My office, 2 p.m. Martha's face lit up. That would be wonderful. Thank you. As the week passed, Richard found himself both dreading and anticipating Monday's meeting. He spent the weekend reviewing his recent research, preparing counter-arguments to any potential challenges she might raise. Monday arrived, and at exactly 2 p.m., there was a gentle knock on his office door. Come in, he called, straightening the papers on his desk to appear busy. Martha entered, today with a different notebook, this one bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed with age. Thank you for seeing me, Professor, she said, settling into the chair across from him. So, Richard said briskly, you mentioned some ideas related to my research? Martha nodded and opened her notebook. I've been following your work on quantum computing for some time, particularly your approach to solving the decoherence problem. Richard raised an eyebrow. Have you? That's a rather specialized interest. For an old woman with no apparent academic credentials? Martha finished with a small smile. Yes, I suppose it is. Richard had the grace to look embarrassed. I didn't mean... It's all right, she said. I understand how it must appear, but perhaps this might help explain. She carefully removed several folded papers from her notebook and handed them to him. Richard unfolded them to find handwritten equations and notes, complex quantum theories, and mathematical proofs that looked decades old. "I wrote these in 1957, Martha said quietly, when I was working on what we now call quantum entanglement theory, though we didn't have that term then." Richard stared at the papers in disbelief. The yellowed pages contained concepts that hadn't been widely understood until the 1980s at the earliest. "If these were really from 1957, that's not possible," he said. "These theories weren't developed until much later." "Not publicly," Martha agreed. "But I assure you, these are original. You'll notice the date at the top of each page." I was ahead of my time in some ways. Richard examined the papers more carefully. The handwriting matched Martha's notes from their previous meeting, just steadier, without the tremor of age. And the dates were indeed marked clearly. March, June, 1957. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at her. "If you developed these theories, why haven't I heard of you? Why weren't these published?" A shadow passed over Martha's face. "That's a long story, Professor. One that reflects a different time in academia." Richard sat back in his chair, his earlier defensiveness fading into genuine curiosity. "I think I'd like to hear that story, Ms. Sullivan." Martha took a deep breath. "I was 22 when I wrote those equations. I had been studying mathematics independently since childhood. My father was a high school math teacher who believed in my abilities, even when no one else did." She gestured to the papers in Richard's hands. "I submitted those theories to several academic journals. They were all rejected. One editor was kind enough to write back personally." Her voice took on a slightly harder edge. "He said my work showed remarkable insight for a young lady, but suggested I find a male colleague to co-author and resubmit, as it would be taken more seriously." Richard winced. "That was unfortunately common then." "Yes," Martha agreed. "But what came next was what truly ended my academic aspirations." She carefully took back her papers, folding them with reverence. "I applied to several universities hoping to find a place where I could continue my research properly. Harvard was one of them." Richard suddenly had an uncomfortable feeling about where this story was heading. "I was granted an interview with the head of the physics department," Martha continued, "Professor William Lancaster. Do you know that name?" Richard nodded slowly. Lancaster was a legend at Harvard, the man who had built the physics program into what it was today. His portrait hung in the main hallway. "He looked at my work for exactly 3 minutes, Martha said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of old pain. "Then he looked at me and said, 'This is impressive. Did your husband help you with it?' Richard closed his eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." When I explained I wasn't married and the work was entirely my own, he laughed. Actually laughed. Then he told me that Harvard had no place for women in theoretical physics, and that perhaps I should consider a more suitable field, like nursing or teaching elementary school. Martha straightened in her chair, her chin lifting slightly. "That was the day I stopped trying to be part of the academic world. But I never stopped learning, never stopped working on my theories. Just in private." Richard sat in stunned silence, looking at the elderly woman before him with new eyes. How many brilliant minds had been lost to prejudice? How many discoveries delayed? "I'd like to see more of your work," he said finally, surprised by his own sincerity. "If you're willing to share it." Martha studied his face, perhaps looking for signs of mockery or condescension. Finding none, she nodded. "I believe I would. Like that, Professor Harrington. Perhaps old ideas might find new life after all." As she gathered her things to leave, Richard found himself wondering what kind of scientist he might have become if he had faced the obstacles Martha had, and what kind of scientist she might have become if she hadn't. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Martha's story and her decades-old equations kept playing in his mind. He'd spent his entire career believing he was at the cutting edge of quantum physics, but those yellowed papers suggested someone had quietly been there long before him, someone who had been shut out of the very institution he called home. At 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep and went to his home office. He pulled up the university's digital archives on his computer, searching for any record of Martha Sullivan or Martha Wilkins, her maiden name she had mentioned. Nothing came up in the student or faculty databases, which wasn't surprising, given what she'd told him. But there had to be some record of her interview, her application, something. After an hour of searching, he found an obscure folder in the archives labeled Physics Department, Inquiries and Applications, 1950-1960. It was a collection of scanned documents that had only recently been digitized as part of the university's history project. Richard scrolled through dozens of letters and applications until a name caught his eye. Martha Wilkins, application date, May 15, 1957. His heart raced as he clicked on the file. There it was, her application to Harvard's physics department, filled out in the same neat handwriting he recognized from her notebooks. Her academic background was impressive. Top marks from a small women's college, independent research, glowing recommendations from 2 professors who described her as exceptionally gifted and possessing a mathematical mind rarely seen. Attached to the application was a letter from Professor William Lancaster, dated June 3, 1957. Richard read it with growing discomfort. Regarding the application of Miss Martha Wilkins, while her academic credentials appear satisfactory, I do not believe she would be a suitable addition to our department. The rigors of theoretical physics are generally ill-suited to the female intellect, which tends toward the practical rather than the abstract. Additionally, our limited resources would be better allocated to candidates with the potential for long-term contributions to the field, rather than those likely to abandon academic pursuits upon marriage. Application denied. Richard stared at the screen, a sick feeling in his stomach. The casual cruelty of the letter was made worse by its formal, matter-of-fact tone, as if Lancaster was simply stating obvious truths rather than reinforcing harmful prejudices. There was one more document in Martha's file, a copy of a paper she had submitted with her application, titled Theoretical Approaches to Particle Entanglement and Non-Local Causality. Richard opened it eagerly, his eyes widening as he read. The paper outlined concepts that were decades ahead of their time, ideas that had won Nobel Prizes when discovered by others years later. At the bottom of the paper was a handwritten note from Lancaster. Interesting but flawed approach. Likely based on misunderstanding of basic principles, not publication quality. Richard pushed away from his desk, anger rising in his chest. The paper wasn't flawed, it was brilliant. Lancaster either hadn't understood it or, worse, had dismissed it simply because of who wrote it. The next morning, fueled by curiosity and a strange sense of obligation, Richard went to the university's physical archives. The basement room was rarely visited these days, with most records having been digitized, but some materials remained only in their original form. I'm looking for any information on a Martha Wilkins or Martha Sullivan from the 1950s, he told the elderly archivist, who seemed delighted to have a visitor. Let me see what I can find, she said, disappearing into the rows of filing cabinets and boxes. She returned 20 minutes later with a thin folder. This was in the physics department historical records. Not much there, I'm afraid. Richard thanked her and sat at a dusty table to examine the contents. Inside was a black and white photograph he nearly missed, a group picture from a 1956 physics conference held at Princeton. The caption listed the names of the 24 men in suits standing proudly in the front rows. Almost as an afterthought, it mentioned typists and assistants in the back row, where 4 women stood, their names not recorded. But there she was, a young Martha Wilkins, standing slightly apart from the other women, her expression serious and focused. She couldn't have been more than 21 or 22, but her eyes held the same intelligence he had seen in the elderly woman who challenged him in his office. Also in the folder was a newspaper clipping from a small local paper, dated November 1957. The headline read, "Local Girls' Mathematical Theory Gains Attention." The short article described how Martha Wilkins, a promising young mathematician, had published a paper in an obscure scientific journal that was causing a stir in certain academic circles. The article ended by noting that Miss Wilkins was now working as a computer the term used then for women who performed complex calculations, at a research facility in New Mexico. Richard carefully photographed everything with his phone before returning the folder to the archivist. His next stop was the science library, where he asked to see archives of all physics journals from the late 1950s. It took hours of searching, but finally in a small publication called Journal of Theoretical Physics and Mathematics, he found it Martha Wilkins' one and only published paper, dated October 1957. The paper was a shortened, simplified version of what she had submitted to Harvard. Reading between the lines, Richard could see how she had dumbed down her work, removed the most revolutionary ideas, made it safer and less challenging to the scientific consensus of the time. Even so, it contained insights that were remarkable for the era. What happened next was even more telling. In the following issue of the journal, there were 3 letters to the editor regarding Martha's paper. 2 dismissed her ideas entirely with condescending language. The third, from a physicist at MIT, acknowledged the paper's interesting approach, but suggested the concepts needed development by a more experienced researcher. That was it. Martha Wilkins disappeared from the academic record after that. No more papers, no follow-up research, nothing, until she walked into his lecture hall nearly 70 years later. Richard sat back in his chair, trying to process everything he had learned. Martha Wilkins had been brilliant, a potential revolutionary in the field, but had been systematically pushed aside because of her gender. How many other Marthas had there been throughout history? How many groundbreaking ideas had been lost because someone didn't look the part of a genius? And how different might physics be today if Martha had been given the chance she deserved? With a jolt, Richard realized he was doing the exact same thing Lancaster had done, dismissing Martha Sullivan because she didn't fit his image of what a physicist should be. An old woman in a faded cardigan couldn't possibly understand quantum mechanics, just as a young woman in the 1950s couldn't possibly have insights worth listening to. He had become what he always swore he'd never be, an academic gatekeeper, protecting his status rather than pursuing truth. The next afternoon, Richard canceled his office hours and drove to the address he had for Martha Sullivan, a modest apartment building on the outskirts of Cambridge. He hesitated before knocking on her door, suddenly uncertain of his purpose. Was he here to apologize, to learn more, to ease his own conscience? Before he could decide, the door opened. Martha stood there, looking surprised but not displeased to see him. "Professor Harrington," she said, "this is unexpected." "I hope I'm not intruding," Richard said awkwardly. "I found your paper, the one from 1957, and Lancaster's letter." Martha's expression tightened slightly. "I see. And you've come to what? Express sympathy for ancient history?" "No," Richard said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. "I've come to ask you about your work. The real work, not the watered-down version you published. I want to understand what you were really proposing about non-local causality." Martha studied him for a long moment, as if assessing his sincerity. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come," she said. "I'll put on some tea." Martha's apartment was small but filled with books. Physics, mathematics, philosophy, literature. One wall was covered entirely with bookshelves. Another held a large whiteboard filled with equations that Richard recognized as related to his own recent research. "You've been following my work," he said, gesturing to the whiteboard. "Among others," Martha replied as she filled a kettle. "Just because I was shut out doesn't mean I stopped learning. The internet has been quite helpful for someone like me. All those journal articles I could never access before, right at my fingertips." She set out 2 mugs and sat at her small kitchen table, motioning for him to join her. "So, Professor Harrington," she said, her eyes sharp and clear, "what exactly do you want to know about my work from 1957? Richard took a deep breath. "Everything," he said. "But first, I owe you an apology. I've been less than welcoming." Martha waved a hand dismissively. "You're hardly the first academic to underestimate me." "That doesn't make it right," Richard insisted. I should have recognized the value of your insights immediately instead of feeling threatened by them. The kettle whistled, and Martha rose to pour the tea. Apology accepted, she said simply. Now about non-local causality. My original theory began with a question. If two particles are entangled. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, her hands gesturing with enthusiasm. Richard listened, occasionally asking questions, taking mental notes. Some of her ideas aligned with current thinking in quantum physics. Others challenged it in ways he'd never considered. By the time they finished their tea, Richard understood something profound. Martha Sullivan wasn't just a brilliant scientist who had been denied opportunity. She was a living reminder that genius could be found anywhere, and that the greatest threat to scientific progress was not ignorance, but arrogance. I have a proposal for you, he said as he prepared to leave. But I'll need a few days to arrange things. Would you be willing to meet me at my office next Monday? Martha looked at him curiously. What kind of proposal? Richard smiled. Let's just say I think it's time for Harvard to correct a mistake that's about 68 years overdue. The weekend passed in a flurry of activity for Richard. He made phone calls, sent emails, and pulled strings he'd never thought he'd use. By Sunday night, he was exhausted but satisfied with his preparations. He'd called in nearly every favor he'd accumulated in 20 years at Harvard, but it would be worth it. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. Richard arrived at his office early, arranging and rearranging papers on his desk, checking his watch every few minutes. At precisely 10 a.m., there was a knock at his door. Come in, he called, standing to greet Martha. She entered slowly, leaning more heavily on her cane than before. Good morning, Professor, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Thank you for coming, Richard said, noticing how tired she looked. Are you feeling all right? Martha smiled faintly. Just a poor night's sleep. Old bones protest sometimes, nothing serious. Richard nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. I've been thinking a lot about your work, he began. Particularly your theories on quantum entanglement and non-local causality. Yes, you mentioned a proposal, Martha said, curiosity brightening her eyes despite her apparent fatigue. I did. Richard took a deep breath. Martha, your work from 1957 wasn't just ahead of its time. It was revolutionary. If it had been properly recognized then, it might have advanced the field by decades. Martha's expression softened. That's kind of you to say, but it's not kindness, it's fact, Richard interrupted. And the fact is, Harvard made a terrible mistake when they rejected you. Professor Lancaster was wrong, not just morally but scientifically. He failed to recognize genuine brilliance because he couldn't see past his own prejudice and Deton. Looked down at her hands, now wrinkled and spotted with age. That was a long time ago, Professor Harrington. Richard, please, he said. And yes, it was a long time ago, but it's not too late to set things right. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an official-looking folder with the Harvard seal. That's why I've arranged this. He handed her the folder. Martha opened it slowly, her eyes widening as she read the contents. This is, she began, her voice trailing off. An offer for a visiting scholar position in the physics department, Richard finished for her. With full access to our labs, resources and faculty, and, he hesitated, then pushed forward. An invitation to give the keynote address at our annual Quantum Physics Symposium next month. Martha stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly. I don't understand. Why would you do this? Because it's the right thing to do, Richard said simply. Your work deserves recognition, and our students deserve to learn from someone like you. Martha closed the folder carefully. It's a generous offer, but I'm not sure I can accept. Richard frowned. Why not? I'm an old woman, Richard. My time for academic glory has passed. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. And frankly, I'm not well. My doctor has been rather insistent that I manage my expectations about the future. Richard felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Are you saying you're ill? Martha sighed. Cancer. Quite advanced, I'm afraid. The treatments aren't working as we'd hoped. Richard sat back, stunned. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Don't be, Martha said firmly. I've had a good life, filled with the pursuit of knowledge, even if it wasn't the academic career I once dreamed of. I worked at the research facility in New Mexico for years, unofficially contributing to theories I could never put my name on. I taught gifted children who might have otherwise been overlooked, just as I was. I never stopped learning, never stopped thinking. Richard leaned forward. Then that's all the more reason to accept the position. Whatever time you have left, be it years or months, wouldn't you rather spend it sharing what you know? Making the contribution you were denied all those years ago? Martha was quiet for a long moment. The symposium, she said finally. When did you say it was? Next month, the 15th, she nodded slowly. I think I can manage that. As for the visiting scholar position, perhaps a modified arrangement. I don't know that I have the strength for regular hours. We'll make it work, Richard promised. Whatever accommodations you need. Martha smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. Then yes, I accept. Thank you, Richard. As she was leaving, Richard asked, What will you speak about at the symposium? Martha paused at the door, a mischievous glint in her eye. Oh, I thought I might address the Harrington paradox. I believe I have a solution that might interest you. Richard laughed in surprise. The Harrington paradox? I've been working on that for years without success. I know, Martha said with a wink. I've read all your papers on it. Your approach is elegant but overcomplicated. Sometimes the simplest answer is the one we overlook. With that tantalizing comment, she left, leaving Richard both humbled and intrigued. Word spread quickly through the department about the elderly woman who had been given a visiting scholar position. Most of Richard's colleagues were skeptical, some openly questioning his judgment. A few were curious enough to look up Martha's single published paper from 1957, surprised to find concepts that had only become mainstream decades later. The days turned into weeks, and Martha became a quiet but noticeable presence in the department. She kept irregular hours due to her health, but when she was there, students and faculty alike found themselves drawn to her. She never spoke at length about her past or complained about the opportunities she'd been denied. Instead, she focused entirely on the physics, offering insights and asking questions that made even seasoned professors stop and think. Richard found himself stopping by her small office frequently, sometimes with questions about her theories, sometimes just to chat. He was surprised by how much he enjoyed their conversations, not just the intellectual stimulation, but Martha's sharp wit and perspective on life. You know, he told her one afternoon, I've been thinking about how many other brilliant minds might have been overlooked throughout history. Martha nodded. There are many of us, Richard. Women, people of color, those from poor backgrounds. Genius doesn't care about social categories, but people certainly do. It makes me wonder what discoveries we've missed because of it. Richard mused. That's the real tragedy, Martha agreed. Not the personal disappointments, but the collective loss of knowledge. The cures not found, the theories not developed, the innovations never realized. All because someone who might have contributed was told they didn't belong. As the symposium approached, excitement built in the department. Martha had been tight-lipped about her presentation, sharing the title, Resolving the Harrington Paradox, a New Approach to Quantum Coherence, but little else. Richard had offered to help her prepare, but she had politely declined, saying she wanted to surprise him. The morning of the symposium, Richard stood at the podium in the packed lecture hall, looking out at the faces of students, faculty, and visitors who had come to hear the day's presentations. In the front row sat the dean and several department heads, all curious about the elderly woman Richard had championed so strongly. Today we have a unique opportunity, Richard began. Many of you have been wondering about our newest visiting scholar, Dr. Martha Sullivan. Some of you have questioned why someone without recent publications or a traditional academic career has been given this position. He paused, looking directly at his most skeptical colleagues. Today you'll have your answer. Dr. Sullivan's work in quantum physics began nearly 70 years ago, and while circumstances prevented her from pursuing a traditional academic path, her brilliance never dimmed. It is my great honor to introduce someone who should have been standing at this podium decades ago, Dr. Martha Sullivan. The applause was polite but reserved as Martha made her way slowly to the stage. Richard helped her up the steps and then took a seat in the front row. Martha adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. Gone was the hesitant, unassuming woman in the faded cardigan. Despite her age and illness, she stood straight, her voice clear and confident. The Harrington paradox, she began, has puzzled physicists for the past decade. Simply put, it asks why quantum coherence appears to break down at specific energy levels when all current models suggest it should remain stable. She gestured to the screen behind her, where her first slide appeared, a complex equation familiar to everyone in the room. Professor Harrington's approach has been to focus on wave function collapse as the primary mechanism. It's elegant, thorough, and unfortunately built on a flawed assumption. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. Richard leaned forward, intrigued rather than offended. Martha changed to the next slide, displaying a modified version of his equation. If we instead consider that quantum coherence operates on multiple simultaneous planes rather than as a single-state function, for the next 45 minutes, Martha led the audience through her solution to the paradox that had stumped Richard and his colleagues for years. Her approach was revolutionary, yet grounded in established principles, complex, yet explained with remarkable clarity. She didn't just solve the paradox. She opened new avenues of exploration that no one had considered. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then Richard stood and began to applaud. One by one, others joined in until the entire hall was on its feet. As Martha made her way back to her seat, Richard could see she was exhausted, but radiant. For perhaps the first time in her life, Martha Sullivan had been heard, truly heard by the scientific community. That was... Richard struggled for words as she sat beside him. Worth waiting 70 years for? Martha suggested with a small smile. Absolutely brilliant, he said. You didn't just solve the paradox, you transformed how we'll approach quantum coherence going forward. As the symposium continued with other presenters, Richard noticed Martha growing paler. By the lunch break, she was visibly struggling. Let me take you home, he offered. No, she insisted. I've waited too long for this day. I'll stay till the end. But by mid-afternoon, it was clear she couldn't continue. Richard quietly arranged for his teaching assistant to drive her home, promising to call her later with a full report of the remaining presentations. As he watched her leave, Richard felt a mix of emotions: admiration for her brilliance and determination, anger at the system that had denied her for so long, and a deep sadness that her recognition had come so late. What he didn't know was that this day, her triumph, her vindication, would be one of Martha Sullivan's last. The days following the symposium were a whirlwind. Martha's presentation became the talk of the physics department, then the university, and soon the wider scientific community. Academic journals requested interviews. Colleagues who had been skeptical now approached Richard asking for introductions, and students lined up outside Martha's small office, hoping to speak with her. But Martha wasn't there to receive them. 3 days after the symposium, Richard received a call from the hospital. Martha had collapsed at home and been taken to the emergency room. By the time he arrived, she was conscious but very weak, propped up against white pillows that made her look even smaller than she was. "This is becoming a habit," she said with a faint smile when she saw him. "Important men visiting me in my sickbed." Richard pulled a chair close to her bed. "You should have told me you were feeling worse." "And miss my moment?" Martha shook her head slightly. "Not a chance." A doctor came in, checked Martha's vital signs, and stepped back with a grave expression. "Try not to tire yourself, Miss Sullivan," he said before leaving them alone again. "That bad, huh?" Martha said, watching the doctor go. Richard swallowed, hard. What do the doctors say? That I've got a few weeks, maybe a month. She said it matter-of-factly without self-pity. The cancer has spread to just about everywhere it can go. Richard felt tears prickling behind his eyes but blinked them away. I'm so sorry, Martha. Don't be, she said firmly. I got to stand, at that podium. I got to share my work. That's more than I ever thought I'd have. Your work, Richard said suddenly. Your research, your theories, they need to be preserved. Properly this time. Martha waved a hand weakly. All my notebooks are in my apartment. 3rd bookshelf from the window, bottom 2 shelves. Take them. Do whatever you think best. I'll collect them today, Richard promised, and I'll make sure they're published under your name, with full credit for your contributions. Martha smiled. That would be nice. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. There's something else I'd like to ask you. Anything, Richard said without hesitation. In my bedroom closet there's a box of letters, from girls and women who took my community science classes over the years. I'd like them to know what happened, that their teacher finally got her chance. Richard nodded, his throat tight. I'll find them. I'll let them know. Martha reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. One more thing, the most important thing. What is it? Don't let this just be about me, she said, her eyes intense despite her weakened state. Use this to change things. Look for the overlooked ones. Find the brilliant minds being wasted because they don't fit someone's idea of what a scientist should be. I will, Richard said, and he meant it more deeply than any promise he'd ever made. Martha's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next few days. Richard visited every day, sometimes bringing news of the reaction to her work, sometimes just sitting quietly beside her bed. He had collected her notebooks as promised, 12 volumes filled with equations, theories, and ideas spanning nearly 7 decades. Reading through them in the evenings, he was repeatedly struck by her brilliance and the tragedy of her isolation from the scientific community. A week after her hospitalization, he arrived to find Martha sleeping, her breathing shallow. The nurse told him she had been unresponsive since the previous evening. Richard sat beside her anyway, opening the latest issue of the Journal of Quantum Physics. Your paper has been fast-tracked for publication, he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. The editor called it groundbreaking. They're dedicating the entire next issue to your work. Martha didn't respond, but Richard continued talking, telling her about the department's plans to establish a lecture series in her name, about the students who had been inspired by her story, about the changes already beginning to take place because of her. You've started something important, Martha, he said softly. It won't end with you. 2 days later, Martha Sullivan passed away peacefully in her sleep. Richard was there, having arranged his teaching schedule to spend as much time at her bedside as possible. In her final moments, she had briefly opened her eyes, seeming to look past him at something only she could see. Then she had smiled, a bright, youthful smile that transformed her face, before closing her eyes for the last time. The funeral was small but well attended. In addition to the hospital staff who had cared for her, several faculty members and students from Harvard came to pay their respects. To Richard's surprise, a group of women ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s also attended, former students from Martha's community science classes, who had responded to the messages Richard had sent. She changed my life, one woman told Richard after the service. I was failing high school science when I started her weekend classes. Now I'm a chemistry teacher myself. She made me believe I could do it. Similar stories emerged from others. The shy girl who now worked at NASA, the single mother who had gone back to school for engineering because Martha had convinced her it wasn't too late, the teenager from a tough neighborhood who had just been accepted to MIT. Martha had never stopped teaching, never stopped encouraging others, even when her own dreams had been deferred. A month after the funeral, Richard stood in his office looking at the framed photograph now hanging on his wall, the image he had found in the archives of young Martha at the physics conference, standing in the back row, unnamed and unrecognized. Beside it hung a new photograph, Martha at the podium during the symposium, her face alight with the joy of finally being heard. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. A young woman entered hesitantly. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair and eyes that darted nervously around the room. "Professor Harrington, I'm Lena Wong. I'm not one of your students, but I was hoping I could talk to you." "Of course," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What can I help you with?" Lena sat down, clutching a worn notebook to her chest. "I read about Dr. Sullivan in the student paper, about how she had all these theories that no one would listen to because she was a woman in the 1950s. Richard nodded. "That's right." "And how you helped her finally get recognition," Lena continued. Even though at first I dismissed her too," Richard finished for her. "Yes, that's also right." Lena took a deep breath and placed her notebook on the desk. "I've been working on something. It's about dark matter and its potential interaction with gravity waves. My physics professor said it was creative but misguided, and suggested I focus on established theories instead." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. How many times had similar words been used to dismiss unconventional thinkers? "May I?" he asked, reaching for the notebook. Lena nodded, watching anxiously as he flipped through the pages. Her handwriting was neat and precise, her diagrams detailed, her calculations methodical. Richard wasn't an expert in dark matter theory, but he knew enough to recognize that her approach was unusual and potentially revolutionary. "This is fascinating," he said honestly. "Have you considered applying for the new Martha Sullivan Fellowship?" Lena's eyes widened. "Fellowship? I didn't know there was one." "It's brand new," Richard explained. "Funded by the physics department to support unconventional thinkers in science, particularly those whose voices might otherwise go unheard." It had been his project since Martha's death, convincing the department and several wealthy donors to establish a fellowship that would seek out and support precisely the kind of brilliant outsiders that the academic establishment had historically overlooked. "The first recipient will be announced next month," Richard continued. "The deadline for applications is next week." Lena's face lit up with hope. "Do you really think I should apply?" Richard thought of Martha, of her brilliance denied for decades, of all the contributions she might have made if given the chance, and of her final request to him. "Look for the overlooked ones." "Yes," he said firmly. "I absolutely think you should apply, and I'd be happy to help you prepare your application." As Lena left his office an hour later, clutching application materials and looking more confident than when she had arrived, Richard turned back to the photographs on his wall. "It's a start, Martha," he said softly. "Just a start." Over the following years, the Martha Sullivan Fellowship grew in prominence, identifying and supporting dozens of promising scientists from underrepresented backgrounds. Martha's posthumously published papers became required reading in advanced physics courses, her approach to quantum coherence spawning a new branch of theoretical research. Richard Harrington changed too. The arrogant professor who had once tried to humiliate an old woman became a champion for inclusion in science, mentoring students others overlooked, challenging colleagues to examine their biases, sharing Martha's story whenever he could. He kept a quotation on his desk, words Martha had written in one of her notebooks in 1957. "Truth doesn't care who discovers it, only that it is discovered. The universe reveals its secrets to those who listen, regardless of who they are." Richard had learned to listen, truly listen, and in doing so, had discovered that the greatest breakthroughs often come from the most unexpected sources. It was Martha's final lesson to him, and perhaps her most important one. And somewhere he liked to think Martha Sullivan was smiling at how much had changed, because an old woman had dared to raise her hand in a lecture hall and point out a simple mistake.